Преди 2 седмици излезе последният така
2 weeks ago, the latest report of the IMF was released, and it was for developed countries, and actually the 3 economists of the fund provided some research, and the finding is that fiscal discipline, budget cuts, especially in times of low economic growth, are much more damaging to the economy than that outweigh benefits in the long term. Of course, these measures of budget austerity reflect, impact the entire public sphere in the UK. Inequalities continue to increase, and the survey of the IMF, as well as other leading organizations, has been debated, has been negatively debated. These imbalances, inequalities that aggravate the divides, and also there are other effects too. These consequences affect the very texture, if you want, of Britain. Budget cuts, other cuts in the measures in education probably will become more, and students will have to pay more than £9,000 for 1 year bachelor studies. This shows that education becomes more and more exclusive, and the situation is similar in healthcare, and we can draw the analogy with Bulgaria. Here things are quite serious. Healthcare in Britain, in the UK, since the establishment of the healthcare system after the Second World War, the first Labour's government has been among the most progressive in the world, completely free healthcare, and survey shows that even conservative voters firmly oppose privatization of the system and major overhaul, because they still remember the years when they could take proper care of their health without paying. And austerity measures of George Osborne hit severely the British healthcare, and underfinancing leads to inefficiencies and also loss of popularity. And James is an insider to all of those politics. I met him in London. He was chief economist at the time of a progressive NGO, New Foundation, and he published different surveys at the times, especially on the damages, short-term damages of austerity measures, even before most of the institutions came to admit the negative impacts of these policies. He was advisor with the Ministry of Finance. He studied at the London School of Economics and University of London, and since fall 2015 he has been advisor to the second ranking, the financial minister in shade, and he knows what an alternative program might be that would provide alternatives, other measures for economic growth, better allocation of income, and other policies. Now I pass the floor, and I hope you will find this full of information.
Thank you. I apologise. I'm going to talk in English, but I think people have a translation if needed. I wanted to start by thanking the organisers for the opportunity to speak here. What I've got, and it's always a bit dubious using a PowerPoint, I think, but what I've got is a few remarks that set first the kind of brief political context of where the Labour leadership is and where it's come from. Second, at more length, the kind of economic context that we have in Britain, which is distinctive. I think there are some lessons to be learned from our experience across the rest of the world and certainly across the rest of Europe, but it is fairly distinctive. And then finally, really some preliminary attempts at laying out the lines of thinking that the Labour leadership is now looking at in terms of its economic policy. So, political context. Obviously, people will have seen the news of Jeremy Corbyn being elected leader of the Labour Party. He emerged seemingly from nowhere as far as the mainstream was concerned. In summer 2015, Jeremy is someone who has been a backbench MP for his entire political career in Parliament. He's been in Parliament since the election that Atanas mentioned in 1983, a great victory for Margaret Thatcher. He's been a backbench MP, most prominently associated with opposition to the Iraq War at the start of the 2000s. It was not expected that he would come anywhere near winning. If you were sharp, you could have got odds on him of something around 200 to 1. A couple of people who put on 10, 20, 100 pounds did extremely well by September when he got elected. It was simply not anticipated by any of mainstream politics, any of the political class, any of the set of media that we have, that this outsider would be able to get elected. The key, in the end, was something that you've seen happening outside of social democratic parties across Europe. If you look at something like the rise of Podemos in Spain, which is you have a large number of particularly young people, and if you look at opinion polls and surveys of those voting in the leadership election for Jeremy Corbyn, they tended to be younger and certainly more working class, certainly less well paid than the rest of the Labour membership. So it was younger people who were losing out after 2008, and in particular after the introduction of austerity in 2010. And Jeremy Corbyn's big offer was, as it says, an end to austerity, to the programme of not just spending cuts, but really an entire approach to government that this government and the previous one was taking, and in a sense making a break with New Labour, with the ideas and approach of Tony Blair, most associated with Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown. So austerity in the UK, the political context, I realise this is in English, but I hope people will be all right with that. It's austerity in the UK was introduced following the formation of a coalition government in May 2010, after the general election that year. So that's unusual in Britain. Normally, although this is almost certainly not going to be the case in the future, normally you have a simple majority in Parliament. First coalition government for a very long period of time between the Conservatives, the right-wing party, the more centre-right party, and the relatively centrist Liberal Democrats. George Osborne from the Conservatives was made Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's the Finance Minister. Immediately announces, and this had been the rhetoric throughout the campaign, that unless public spending was reined in by government, unless government clamped down on public spending, then Britain would be quite literally turning into Greece, and not in the good sense of the weather improving, but in the bad sense of a massive debt crisis, of riots on the streets, of unemployment of 20, 50%. That was the rhetoric that was applied during the election campaign. That was the rhetoric that George Osborne used to argue for this so-called emergency budget. He talked everything up in June 2010, and that unless it was immediately introduced very sharp spending cuts, Britain would turn into Greece. We'd be a basket case economy. So really just an attempt to frighten people. What he offered was the biggest package of spending cuts since the Great Depression. So that's for 2, 3 generations. And what he attempted to apply? What he attempted to apply was precisely that package of dramatic cuts over the next few years. Alongside this, the more sort of familiar neoliberal innovation of reform of public institutions, of privatisation of public institutions, is running alongside the austerity programme, the programme of severe spending cuts. So the BBC and the NHS have been particularly singled out. Both remain very popular institutions in Britain. Both of them have been subjected to a programme of reform over the last 6 years or so. This is the actual pattern of it. I'm going to come on to a bit of context around the economics of the situation in a sec. So initially, Osborne attempts to apply spending cuts as he threatened in June 2010. The economy promptly stagnates for the next 2 years. There is a sort of simple Keynesian economic lesson here that if an economy is just recovering from a recession, or even worse, in a recession, it's a rather bad idea for government to cut its spending. And as I'll come on to, there is, I think, a consensus amongst macroeconomists now from the mainstream, covering it entirely, that austerity, as applied in Europe and as applied in Britain over this period of time, was a mistake. So the recovery comes to a halt by the end of 2010. Osborne then, in practice, despite the rhetoric, eases off on the spending cuts. The recovery, economic growth, returns around about the end of 2012. Real wages finally start to pick up by the end of 2014, just in time for a May 2015 election, which the Conservatives won with a majority. To put that in, I hope this is reasonably clear, but I'll try and talk you through it. What you're looking at here is the government deficit minus the impact of the recession, shown as a share of GDP over time. So in other words, what you're kind of seeing is the squeeze being applied by government to its deficit. This is registering the extent of austerity. And what you see initially with this dotted line, this is the government's forecast for austerity from June 2010. This is what they said they were going to do, what they expected to happen. The original plan was to end the austerity programme with a surplus by here. In other words, it will be 5 years of tight spending cuts, and then you've cleared the government's deficit. The reality is, you can see in this blue line here, where there are tight spending cuts to start with, Osborne eases off, and then from this point onwards, this purple line is his forecast, back onto austerity from mid last year. In other words, despite the rhetoric, despite the talking up and the hype around austerity, markedly little was applied. The programme was a complete failure in the sense of the deficit remains very, very wide, and we have promised now another 5 years of spending cuts to come. In other words, the failure of the programme means that the programme has to be extended for 5 years in the future. Osborne is surprisingly keen on these kind of 5-year plans, but the things never seem to quite reach any sort of conclusion. The contrast between the rhetoric and the reality is quite striking throughout. And I emphasise this point because, at least in part, what the government has very successfully done is win an argument about the story, the narrative that we have on the economy, that the reason the crisis of 2008, 9, 10 happened and was so severe was because the previous Labour government had overspent. This doesn't stand up to scrutiny. That if you take the previous Labour government, the share of spending as a share of GDP on average, it's 39% of GDP is government spend under Labour. Under John Major, Conservative Prime Minister before Blair, it's 40% of GDP. Under Margaret Thatcher, the government spends on average 41% of GDP. In other words, it can't have been Labour overspending that caused the crisis, but this is the government's story, and they've stuck to it. The reality is that the crisis was severe because of not public sector debt, not government debt, but private sector debt. And I'll come on in a second to showing that in practice. In other words, as we've argued, and as the new Labour leadership has argued, austerity in Britain is a political choice. It's not something that you have to do because government has overspent and the economy is crashing. It's not something you even have to do because the European Central Bank and the EU and the IMF say you have to do it. It's something that you do because you've chosen to do it. The detail here is the reason why the government has chosen to do this. And here I'd point towards just a very good paper by Maurice Obstfeld, who is now chief economist at the IMF, from 2013 called On Keeping Your Powder Dry. He's very mainstream, very neoclassical, if you like. And he argues in 2013 that countries with large financial systems, countries with very substantial banks, with very major debts accruing in those banks, have to apply austerity, have to reduce public spending, because when you have a large financial system, there is always a risk of a crisis, like we saw in 2008. So in other words, because your financial system is so big and has so many liabilities, so many debts, you have to squeeze the public sector in case your financial system collapses. The problem doesn't lie with the public sector, it lies with your private sector economy and the financial system in particular. You need to mitigate the risk of future crisis. What this turns into, if the austerity program is applied, is something that we haven't really seen in previous British history, not since the Second World War. This shows government spending in real terms for every financial year from 1955 through to a forecast running to 2020. It also shows public sector receipts. So this blue line is taxes, the red line is spending. Broadly speaking, you can see that spending and taxation match each other over the post-war period. You have some recessions where spending is much higher than taxes. When you get to the crisis here, strikingly, it's a demonstration again that the idea that 2008 was caused by government spending is entirely wrong, that you can see it is a slump in tax receipts that creates the deficit, that creates the problem, and not a sudden explosion of spending. And what the government intends to do, you see at the forecast right at the end, which is allow the economy to grow, but hold and cut public spending as much as it can. In other words, they'll be shrinking the size of the state. They'll be making the government smaller over time, in what amounts to a complete break with the entire experience of the post-war period. None of this gets you into the underlying problems here. The underlying problems that austerity fails to address tend to lie in the private sector and the structure of the economy, quite distinct from whatever government is doing. That we have an economy in Britain that is increasingly good at producing low-wage work, insecure work, zero-hour contracts, very flexible working, very limited rights at work. That you have an economy that is not as productive as it once was, that is good at low productivity outputs, that you have this slump in productivity. And productivity, of course, is the key, if you're a developed economy, the key to securing economic growth. How efficiently you produce determines how rapidly your economy will grow. If you have a slump in productivity, your prospects for long-term growth, or at least growth that will be to the benefit of most people, are limited. You have low investment, you have high and still rising levels of wealth inequality, and you have this problem of a very large financial system. You can sort of see this here. This is the slump in productivity, shown as a relationship to 1997. In other words, this is output per hour for, in blue is the UK, and in red is the G7, the other major developed economies excluding the UK. And what you see from 97 is quite rapid productivity growth all the way through to the crash here. When productivity stops growing in the UK, it slumps, it stagnates. For the rest of the G7, productivity carries on rising. Now, if productivity is the essential part of getting any kind of growth over a long period of time, of growth that will benefit most people rather than the few people at the top, this is a disaster. It's not one that's immediately apparent in the sense that the economy is still growing, but it's growing on the back of low paid, low productivity, not particularly desirable work. And this is probably the biggest single crisis the British economy faces. Here you see the slide, it's the same thing, this time the UK in red. The slide in investment. Britain always is a low investment and has been since the Industrial Revolution, a relatively low investment economy. This is the rest of the G7 showing investment as a share of GDP. It's fallen over time. It's now fallen for the few years after this period, and it remains lower than the rest of the G7. Without investment, you don't get the new equipment, you don't get the new technology, you're not going to address this slump in productivity. This tangle of graphs and lines is showing over a very long period of time, back to 1884, with figures taken from Thomas Piketty. Again, it's the G7. And what it shows is not the 1%, but the top 0.1% share of national income. So of the whole pie of the economy, how much is the tiniest fraction, the 0.1% of the top, grabbing? And what you see over time is the post-war period is much more equal. Then you hit Margaret Thatcher, neoliberalism, that whole pattern, and you get an explosion of inequality as the very, very wealthiest at the top of society get more and more of the pie overall. And that explosion is particularly bad in the UK and the US, of course. And this is the current account. In other words, how much does Britain import or export from the rest of the world? Again, shown as a share of GDP. And what this is telling you is that basically, pretty much continually since 1997, Britain always imports more than it exports, and it always earns less from the rest of the world than the rest of the world earns from Britain. This is another kind of structural problem. It's buried. You don't see it immediately. But the problem here, with your current account deficit, if you're running an imbalance with the rest of the world, if you're always trying to buy more from the rest of the world than you're selling to the rest of the world, is that you have to borrow money to do this. And Britain today has one of the largest external debts of any major developed economy. And the final thing is one that's striking but needs talking through. And it's a very distinctive British feature. What you're looking at here is every EU member arranged alphabetically. And for every EU member, you're showing every single region inside that country in terms of how rich it is. From the poorest over here to the richest over here, relative to the EU average. So how wealthy is a particular area? Poor over here, rich over here, in each country. And if you look, most countries are fairly unequal. Some places are poor, some places are rich. You get to the UK, which is what happens here. In other words, you have the richest single place in the entire European Union, which is the City of London, right in the middle. And then all the way down here, you have places that are significantly poorer than the EU average. And if you notice, of course, comparable to, let's say, Sofia in Bulgaria, that sort of thing. It's a huge spread of inequality, regional inequality that exists now. So you put all this together, and what you have isn't an economy that is going to continue to produce growth and to continue to produce decent jobs and work for people in the future. What you have is a series of significant structural problems that place the entire recovery, the entire boom, on a very, very shaky foundation and mean that over time you simply end up getting insecure work, lower pay, and no real prospects for, in this case, a whole generation of people to escape that pattern of low pay, insecure work, expensive accommodation, and all the rest of it. This is, of course, one of the drivers behind Jeremy Corbyn and his vote and his leadership. But it also says that if your attempt to deal with these problems, these structural problems, is simply to say government should spend more money, you're not addressing the problem. government could spend more money. Austerity is generally a bad idea, but until you get to the point of addressing the underlying problems, the problem of productivity, the problem of low investment, if the government goes and spends more money, you're not going to deal with these problems. It's not enough to argue for Keynesianism. So in other words, you need a different approach here. You need to think differently about how to deal with all of these economic issues. And this gets onto the politics. That I think there's been an idea that what Jeremy Corbyn represents and John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, represent is this return to the past. That really this is about trying to turn the clock back. That this is nothing more than an attempt to go back into some imagined time that doesn't exist anymore where everything was better. I think we can't work on that basis. That we have to be very clear in terms of what the Labour Party and the Labour leadership argue, that this is about what we're going to do in the future, and that this is not about trying to find some point in the past where everything seemed better. 1997 is when Tony Blair won his landslide victory. For a lot of people, this is a peak. 1945 is the famous reforming government of Clement Attlee that set up the NHS, that established the welfare state. We can't turn the clock back to any of these things. There is no, the global debt bubble that New Labour relied on burst. The Bretton Woods agreements that made the international economy work for social democracy over the post-war period has collapsed and collapsed in the 70s. We can't turn the clock back. If you look across Europe, the traditional base of support for social democratic parties like Labour is in a state of turmoil and flux. That the historic, often manual working class organised in trade unions is breaking up. There are still plenty of workers, but they're not necessarily in unions. And then that base of support for social democracy in electoral terms doesn't exist in the same way. And finally, this combination of low growth, the idea in mainstream economic circles of what they call secular stagnation, that the era of high growth is over, and from here onwards it will be low growth, combined with very high wealth inequality, means that if your program says simply, we'll redistribute income, we'll take income from one group of people and give it to another, it's going to be very hard to make that work because growth is so low, so incomes are not rising, and it's inequality of wealth rather than inequality of income that's the critical problem underneath it. And as mentioned, the work of Thomas Piketty here, I think, is quite decisive in winning an argument that inequality of wealth is one of the fundamental issues to be tackled. So what's our approach? Well, first I will say, and I should say this for all of my remarks, these are very early days. We are not expecting an election until 2020. There is some talk of an election perhaps as early as October this year, depending on the vote in the referendum. So we're working on the basis of 2020, but it could be somewhat sooner than that. In other words, we are still at an early stage in developing policy, of suggesting ideas, of trying to open a conversation with this. But what I want to do is outline the three kind of areas we're looking at. As Asanas mentioned, the International Monetary Fund, there is a kind of intellectual climate to make this work, I think. That when you have the International Monetary Fund now saying that neoliberalism, the neoliberal agenda, has failed, it's very clear there's a desire to try and do something different. The challenge is in laying out what that different thing might be. So I'd say at the minute we've got kind of three cornerstones of the policy, or three major areas that we're looking at, which I'll come on to in the next few slides. The first was the announcement by John McDonnell back in March of what we're calling our fiscal credibility rule. This is a strict rule we want to introduce to close the current deficit on government spending. So that's day-to-day government spending, spending on things like wages and salaries and procurement, the day-to-day spending of government, to close that deficit over a 5-year period. Where we break with George Osborne is we want government to be able to carry on investing. We think this is central to delivering a recovery that works to the benefit of most people. George Osborne has cut investment and wants to cut it further. We think without investment, you're not going to get the kind of recovery that we want. And the idea here is to try and get into and break the narrative, the story that the Conservatives have won quite convincingly for large numbers of people, that it was Labour overspending that was a problem, that Labour is in denial about the problem. We want to be able to say, no, we're going to draw a line under this, deal with the deficit in a fair way that allows for investment, and then move the conversation on. There's another group of work under what I'm calling here the entrepreneurial state, which is an expression of Mariana Mazzucato, who is Professor of Economics down in Sussex University. And really it's the idea of making industrial strategy work in the 21st century. If you take the neoliberal period from the 70s through to now, for the developed economies, particularly the US and the UK, the belief that government could not and should never intervene to shape the economy was a guiding principle. It is central to neoliberalism that the government cannot and should not try and shape the economy. The argument that Mazzucato and others are presenting is that this gives you worse outcomes than you get to otherwise. In the case of Britain, it's very clear that a failure of government to intervene drives low investment. That a failure of government to intervene means, for instance, in the last few months, we have the entire British steel industry threatened with disappearance. A major crisis around the future of that industry because we have an ideology and a rhetoric and a belief in government that government should never intervene. So you want to break with that, break with low investment, break with a kind of rent-seeking, property is all-important version of how an economy operates, and start to shape and reshape the kind of economy we live in through government intervention. Investment in science and technology, I think, is a major part of that. Britain has a very, very low rate of R&D spend relative to other major developed economies. And the final cornerstone, in some ways, is the most radical. It's what John McDonnell has called democracy and decentralization. And this is, again, making a break with the past, or some of the past, of social democracy, which up until now in Europe has tended to see that if you have a social problem, government should intervene, government should shape the economy. That's how we do politics. In other words, there is an issue, you have to get government to sort it out. Historic demand of nationalisation would be an example of this. If you have an industry, the old social democracy would say, nationalise it to make it run better. The difficulty we have with this, as I indicated earlier, is that there's a very deep cynicism, not just about big corporations, but also about big government. That there's a lack of belief that government would necessarily be any better at nationalising an industry than the private sector would be. And that further to this, if you look at new technologies, renewables, renewable energy is a very good example of this. They tend to operate on a smaller scale. If you build a wind farm, if you build a wind turbine, it's relatively small compared to building a nuclear power plant. It's decentralized, of necessity. And if it's decentralized, it doesn't make much sense to try and centralize everything as much as possible by simply saying nationalization is the key, big government is the key. In other words, we're trying to get into a tradition in the British Labour movement of a kind of bottom-up, grassroots organising that's already starting to happen on the ground. There are local communities that are taking ownership of their own wind farms or little water turbines to generate electricity. Local councils are starting to do the same thing. So it's a decentralization. You're getting into the question of ownership. You're not just saying privatize everything. You're saying, why don't we have a cooperative form of ownership? Why don't we have the ability of workers in their enterprises to, as it say, exercise a right to own, that workers can run their own businesses? For instance, there is heading towards us the major issue of the retirement of baby boomers, of people who are running their own businesses now, who are approaching retirement. A large number of these, you're talking many hundreds of thousands, in fact, over the next few years. And if they retire, that business simply closes down. So rather than have a successful small business simply close because the owner has retired, why not give that business to the people who work there? And there are a number of local authorities in Britain, Labour authorities, putting in place schemes to enable that to happen. That you're, instead of thinking it's the government at the centre that's going to resolve the issue, you're giving the initiative back to the locality. The final bit on here is the issue of corporate governance, that we have in Britain, as elsewhere, but America is perhaps the other striking example. Corporate structures that have produced, and clearly produced, over the last 20, 30 years, the most extraordinary disparity in pay for those at the top relative to everyone else. The chief executive officers are now paid around about 150 times the average worker. And this is you can see it almost as a direct result of having corporate structures which think of shareholder value, which think of short-termism, in which remuneration committees are all, something like a closed shop, a little gang that gets together to set pay. We need to start to crack that open and think about how we might run major businesses and corporations in a much more open, democratic, inclusive way. I want to finally get on to just some slides on Brexit, because I know it's a hugely important issue, one way or the other. Labour and the Labour leadership's position is that they're calling for a vote to remain in the EU. The reason for doing that is in two parts. The first is that if you look at what the IMF or the OECD or almost any economic forecaster will say, the shock, the immediate shock of Brexit, all of these forecasters will tell you will produce a recession. And a recession is obviously not good for people who work, and a recession with this Conservative government would mean more austerity. That shock is something that clearly is not worth the risk, is the argument from the Labour leadership here. However, we also want to recognise that it's no use simply giving a free pass to the European Union. There is a solid case for working to reform and change how the European Union operates, and doing so with our partners in Europe. At this point in time, opinion polling on the whole suggests that Remain is going to win. It may be quite close, but Remain is going to win. There are some opinion polls that suggest Leave has inched ahead. What is likely to be decisive in this is the very large number of undecided voters. There are still, if the polls are correct, many millions of people who have yet to make up their mind, and the referendum is 2 weeks away. So there is clearly a fight to try and win this idea of voting to Remain, but wanting to do something different and do something better in the future. My own guess, for what it's worth, and this is an entirely personal guess, is that this will end up being a vote to remain inside the EU, given the way in which those undecided people are likely to swing over the next few weeks. Where do we go from here? And I'm wrapping up. Well, this is by way of an outline. We're at an early stage in all of this. Quite an important part at this stage is an attempt by the Labour leadership to shift the narrative and to broaden the conversation about the economy and economic policy, which has been dominated over the last 6 years by the idea of austerity and the necessity of austerity. We want to get out of that. We want to broaden what people are talking about, and we're attempting to do so with a series of initiatives lecture series with prominent economists, people like Joseph Stiglitz and others, up and down the country, which have been packed, hundreds of people turning out to debate alternatives to conservative austerity. We had a State of the Economy conference in London a couple of weeks ago, well over 800 in attendance, a series of workshops, meetings, seminars to build up this idea that we can change the argument and the discussion about the economy away from this failure that is austerity and towards something that's optimistic about the future, that has some sense of what we might do instead of neoliberalism. And we've set up, of course, an Economic Advisory Council, again with Stiglitz, Tamar Piketty, and other world-leading economists to provide a kind of intellectual ballast to the work that we're attempting to lay out here. It's a slow process of policy development. We are at an early stage. I've given you the kind of outlines of roughly the areas we'll be looking at. The key to this, of course, is getting that coalition together, getting those different groups of people in British society, presenting them with a positive, forward-looking, optimistic alternative to the kind of fearful, backward-looking austerity politics of the Tories, and presenting that in a credible, robust, costed, and effective manner. That, I think, is the challenge over the next few years or so. If there's an election in October, it'll be a challenge over the next few months. But with any luck, that may or may not happen. I'm going to end on that point. I'm happy to take questions and contributions from there. Thank you.
Thanks, James, for this very insightful talk. Сега ще преминем към въпроси. Първите съм си запазил за мен, след което ще дам микрофона към публиката. Първо два въпроса. Първия е...
Two questions first.
The first is about the referendum. Yesterday, I didn't go into detail, but the referendum I got it that referendum will take place in a different way from those in Bulgaria. What would happen if on the 23rd, leaving of the EU wins? So will there be on the following day? There will be no vote at the Parliament, and David Cameron would announce that they will be stepping on to a quite lengthy procedure to debate, discussion. What would happen? Tell us. What would happen if Britain, they vote to leave, in favor of leave? The second question, what would be the effects of liberalization and the privatization of public transport? What was the impact in the 80s of public transport?
So, just on those two, on Brexit, the truth is no one knows what would happen if Britain votes to leave the European Union. It's not happened before, and the sheer range of uncertainty attached to this is not a bad reason for saying that you shouldn't, in fact, take the risk, given the range of uncertainty. So no one is quite clear. I've not seen personally anything from the Leave campaign that makes very clear that they would have a plan B for Brexit if the vote does go towards Leave. But I would say polling at present suggests that the vote is going to be towards Remain in any case. And I think with the kind of case the Labour leadership is presenting, I think that that's a robust case for those particularly Labour voting, working class voters who are still a large part of the undecided people who are out there. So it's incredibly uncertain what would happen if the vote is towards Leave. If the vote is to Remain, I think we have to follow through on the claim about the need for reform, and I think there has to be a serious conversation both in Britain and across the EU about how that reform takes place, because it's obvious that there will be a substantial degree of popular dissatisfaction with the functioning of the European Union. On the privatisation of transport, the railways were privatised in the 1990s, Other forms of public transport, buses, were privatized earlier in the 1980s and late 1980s, early 90s. In both cases, what has happened is, and this was predicted at the time and it's come to pass, is that particularly for buses, investment has fallen off. In the case of railways, investment was starved for a good long period of time, and things got so bad that eventually the infrastructure, the track and the stations had to be renationalised, which has actually helped lift investment on the railways to really quite a high level over the last few years. So it was partially renationalised in 2004. There has been more investment, but crudely, because that you have profit-seeking firms in a rather opaque structure to run the railways, the effect on ticket prices has been dramatic. British ticket prices, the price of transport is now, I think, the highest in Europe and must be amongst the highest anywhere in the world. If you look at opinion polls, the support for the renationalisation of the railways, which is a plank and has been a plank of Jeremy Corbyn's programme, it makes sense to have a centralised operation like railways in the hands of a single operator. Support for the nationalisation of the railways is 60% or more, including a clear majority of Conservative voters. Now that gives you some sense of the popular feeling about the privatised transport system and the privatised railways, that people are unhappy with the way things have played out, and support for nationalisation has grown significantly over the few years since privatisation occurred.
Svetozar Sări, Civil Movement for Complete Employment. I have the following question. I very attentively listened and we fully support your concept of the austerity with respect to the effects of austerity measures on European economies. You didn't say anything about monetary sovereignty. We see that British government said that even in any case, if they leave or stay in the EU, they would stay always out of the Eurozone. They would never take the euro as their own currency. Do you believe that the Eurozone, it's an actually hidden currency board. It's a covert currency board. Do you believe that the Eurozone is a form of attempting banks to start exercising power in Europe? We saw the Greek government. It was not led by the people in the streets, not by parliament, but government is forced to do things that are not good for the people by the banks. They are forced by the banks to do that.
Hi there, James. My name is Martin Dimitrov. I'm from the Bulgarian newspaper Capital, which has nothing to do with Das Kapital. But anyway, I have two questions. The first one is, do you think, can you elaborate a bit more about the internal debates within the Labour Party about the EU Brexit, the Brexit referendum, because we know that there was some, and that maybe you're sending a mixed message to your voters, which are definitely not decided 100%. And the second question is, how does the Labour look at the shared economy that is being, is sprawling at the moment? Things like Airbnb, Uber, and so on and so forth. Do you have anything regarding taxation that you would change, and so on? Oh, and sorry, and finally, a very quick one. You lost Scotland, basically, in the past couple of years. Is this idea of making a coalition with the other stakeholders include the SNP, and how do you plan to get back Scotland, basically? Thank you.
Здравейте. Илия Лазаров от списание Икономика. На мен ми е малко по-интересно.
I would like to know more about the specific measures the Labour Party undertake in favor of Britain Stronger Than Europe campaign. Is there some specific campaign going on? How do they explain to voters possible consequences of a Brexit? Because we know that they have quite serious electoral mass.
On the euro, look, it's sort of stating the obvious to say that the euro has not exactly been a roaring success for all concerned. One of Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, one of his better decisions when he was Chancellor was to rule out Britain joining the Eurozone. So that, I think, is fairly clear by this point, that the institutional design was flawed and it's a serious job of work to overcome those flaws. On the issue of banks' power, the euro isn't really decisive here. That if you take Britain, which is not a eurozone member, you have some of the largest banks in the world. You have banks that, when they collapsed in 2008, were able to ask for and received bailouts that, if you take the IMF estimate of total funding and total support made available to those banks, came to £1.2 trillion, or 100% of British GDP. Now, if you can do that, that's a kind of power, and that has little to do with the Eurozone. I think there's a serious question, partly coming through in this, that if you have a banking system that is not delivering funding and investment and loans and capital to small businesses as well as it should be, to areas of the country outside of London, to activities other than mortgages for property, then you have a banking system that really isn't working. And again, I think that's widely recognised. The challenge for Labour is coming up with a credible plan on how you deal with this. I think the idea of a national investment bank, I think the idea of having community and local and regional banks, which Britain does not have, would move a long way towards solving at least some of those issues. On the mixed messages, I don't buy this. I think both Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell have been very, very clear that they're calling for a vote to remain. Both of them have been trooping up and down the country to traditional Labour places and presenting that case to remain and reform. So I don't think there's a question of mixed messages there. And I don't think there's a question of a divided party. If you compare and contrast with the Conservatives, who are tearing themselves apart over the issue of the referendum, that to a large extent we are having this referendum because the Conservative Party are tearing themselves apart, that this is about the Conservative Party much more than it's about what anybody else wants. I doubt other people would have even wanted the referendum. But yet we end up with this thing, that it's an internal party row that's now being forced onto the rest of us with potentially serious consequences. So that's where the divide lies. On the shared economy, I think you raise an absolutely essential point here, which is there's an awful lot of hype about the shared economy and you give it a nice name. You say it's a shared economy when you have drivers for one of these new taxi firms that are being pretty much mercilessly exploited at this point. It's a nice name for it, but you may not actually be delivering much in the way of sharing. The challenge for Labour, as it is for any other social democratic party, is that if the way we work is changing, and it is, self-employment in Britain is higher than it has ever been. More and more people are not in traditional forms of work and traditional labour contracts. How do you extend the protections that the traditional labour contract offered to people who are on zero-hour contracts or they're self-employed? It's not fair to have a two-tier workforce where some people are full-time and relatively protected and some people are in the sharing economy or the gig economy or whatever you want to call it and are not protected. So there's a challenge in making that work. John McDonnell last week was at the launch of a report looking at, and it's an idea for consideration, it's nowhere near and it's certainly not policy as yet, but it's an idea for consideration of a universal basic income as a potential means to deal with some of these challenges that the changing world of work is now throwing up. There was a question on, if I understood it, on the specific measures Labour takes in terms of Brexit. Well, I think the decision was taken by the Labour leadership, and they were correct in this, to say that there is a Labour case to be made for Remain, that Stronger in Europe can make a different, Britain Stronger in Europe can make their own case here, that there is a Labour case to be made, and also that there should be a positive case to be made, that it's not enough to troop up and down and trying to say how terrible and awful things are, you must vote the right way. I don't think that's necessarily taking people who are facing a difficult decision seriously, that you have to offer a positive case. You'd have to say things like, why do we not have a government here that's making more use of the funding available from the European Investment Bank? That why do we have a government in Britain, I should say, not here, a government in Britain that is not prepared to work productively with European institutions, and how much better we could be, all of us, in Britain and across Europe, if you had that approach. That's the kind of positive case for Remain and reform that the Labour leadership have been presenting.
I'll ask also in English. George Supari from the Greens. My first one is, I was flabbergasted to listen to the debate about with yesterday Nigel Farage before with Boris. How you're going to explain how you're going to win with your quite elaborate program against such kinds of rhetorics. The second one is, in a small print in your presentation, there was quite often mentioned democracy, democratizing the economy, the political system, and so on. How we are going to manage this one without changing the first of all the electoral law in UK, and second, what is your opinion about DM and the Varoufakis movement? Thank you.
Доцент Асенова, аз бих искал един малко по-финансов въпрос.
I would like to ask a question more on the financial aspect. I know that you have tax reform going on in the UK, aimed mainly towards reducing the profit tax rate, which is supposed to go down to 16% in 2018, and the withholding tax, where you will move on, you will shift towards the German system. Do you have any idea what's happening with the tax reform in the UK? Русица Чубанова, Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. In Bulgaria, we know all the interesting books that have been written by the members of your foundation. Jacobs, Martin Summers, Hilary Wainwright, Roberts, Arguments for the New Left, and others. I would like to ask you about Mariana Mazzucato and her idea for a joint project with the World Bank and the IMF and the European Investment Bank to coordinate their efforts to resolve the issues that cannot be resolved within the entrepreneur state concept. It is a book that she was awarded first prize for economic writings 2 years ago. Thank you.
Question. Mariana's Mazzucato is a member of the Economic Advisory Council for the Shadow Chancellor, so she's had a big impact on the kind of developing thinking that we have. I previously mentioned that one of the points that has been made by the Labour leadership in the referendum campaign is the need to make more effective use of the European Investment Bank. Britain, you know, it's like leaving money on the table virtually and walking away. I mean, that's kind of what's taking place. So there is a need to have, rather than simply private sector-led development initiatives. And if you look at what George Osborne and the Conservative and coalition governments have done, their inclination is always to try and find some way to coax the private sector into investing. This will get onto the point about taxation. You know, if you cut corporation tax, the theory is you'll get more investment because companies will be happier to invest. The reality, as I've shown, is you get a low-rate investment and you get large corporations in Britain sitting in their bank accounts on about £700 billion that they're not investing at all. Now, this is similar to what's happening in the US and across the major economies, but it's very pronounced in the UK. You get hoarding. So one part of addressing this issue of investment is how do you stop that hoarding of wealth, just sitting on wealth, happening? And how do you put it into productive uses? What Marianne is very good at is thinking about the kind of institutions you need that can deliver this, of which a National Investment Bank in Britain would be an obvious contender. I think I've sort of covered the corporation tax cuts. I don't think there's no convincing economic case to say that you should cut corporation tax, which is the profits tax, the headline tax you mentioned, to the very, very low rates that this government is now proposing. It's not turning into investment. It's not turning into, certainly not turning into more revenues. You're just losing revenue by doing this. There is also a need to address the issue of tax avoidance and tax evasion. You know, the amount that is now hoarded in tax havens globally is estimated to be around $21 trillion. These are huge sums of money now that very, very rich individuals, very large corporations are successfully able to duck out of the responsibility that everyone else has to pay tax, and that Britain and British firms and accountancy firms are sitting in the middle of this scandal of tax avoidance. And it's turned into a real public anger when you see Google, for instance, not paying or paying absolute peppercorn tax for a whole decade because you have a tax authority in Britain which gives up and just says, we'll do a deal. We'll take whatever we can get. You know, this is a major public scandal. It's going to be a priority, I think, for any future government, certainly any future Labour government, to attempt to get the tax system to a point where people are taxed and corporations are taxed fairly, and avoidance and evasion on a very large scale isn't happening. It is, of course, another point in favour of Europe-wide and European Union collaboration, because the initiatives being taken at a European level are central to dealing with the issue of tax havens right the way across Europe. You need international cooperation on that. There is Nigel Farage, and what do you do? Well, I missed the debate. I try and avoid watching Nigel Farage, truth be told. But I can imagine what it was like. And I think you're right, absolutely right. How do you turn a load of graphs and quite an involved story into something simple that you can knock on a door and tell someone what you're trying to do? I think you're absolutely correct to say that. Now, I'm an economist rather than a PR person, so I give you the graphs. But I think if you want to talk about how you boil this down to a simple, clear story, it looks something like your wages are low because there's not enough productive investment. Your rent is high because there's too much speculation. That if you can get to the story that makes clear where the real culprits, Nigel Farage invents culprits. He wants people to think if your hospital isn't up to scratch, blame a Bulgarian, blame a Romanian. If you get people to think about the real culprits, the tax avoiders, for instance, the super rich in this case, then you can start to have a story which works. And you can start to match it up to the kind of more developed thinking and program that we're trying to lay out here. Because I think it's the simple story, the clear narrative that wins. Austerity is, in economic terms, nonsense. But the story is a good one, and that's why it's had such power, and that is why the Conservatives have been able to implement it.
I have two questions. One is connected to the relations with the Greens in England, Green Party. As to Brexit, we know that the Greens in the UK for quite a long time are campaigning in favor of Britain's staying in favor of EU. And more broadly, how do you see in the picture that you sketched out and the progressive left movement as a whole, how do you see where do Greens fit onto this progressive trajectory? Second question, the refugee crisis and what the position of the Labour Party is on refugee crisis, more particularly the support to David Cameron on a couple of occasions provided to the Bulgarian government in its policies, in infringement in violation of a number of international rules and human rights, etc.
In this country, we have flat taxes, flat direct taxes. If asked to advise the Bulgarian government to abolish them or go ahead with this type of taxation, what will be your advice? My second question. I followed the campaign of your Prime Minister during the last year, whether to stay or leave the EU. My impression from what I was listening to his statements was that he wanted much more, but finally he got very, very modest compromises from Brussels. There are two schools for the future of EU. To go on, as Wolfgang Schäuble insists, with further and further centralization of all decision-making in Brussels, to empty from decision-making power the national institutions, which will make senseless to have national elections, parties with different programs, end of democracy. The other one is to make the future European Union a unification of independent national states, or in other words, to make it federation, or, as some people express it, unified European United States, or to make it confederation. Thank you.
The very first thing that Jeremy Corbyn did after his election as leader was announced back in September was to go and attend a march, the biggest ever held in Britain, on the issue of the migration crisis, where there are many tens of thousands of people there, and make a clear speech in support of the rights of migrants. He's visited, of course, the camp, rights of migrants and of refugees in particular, and he's visited the camp in Calais. I think his own position on this is absolutely clear, and I think the Labour leadership have made the case that migration is a net benefit to the UK absolutely clear as well. It obviously is a net benefit. Any credible research in this, whatever Nigel Farage might say, will show that migration from recent EU members over the last 10 years in Britain, has been a net contributor to the tax take when you take account of the public services that these people have consumed. So it's a net economic gain, and a clear one at that. But the case, I think, has to be made there. On flat taxes, I just think they're an atrocious idea. It's appalling that this has ever been allowed to be treated as in any way a serious or credible approach to economic policy. I think what lurks behind it is the utterly discredited idea that free market outcomes are always correct, that the more free market you have, the better, that this government should be as small as possible, because certainly those people arguing for flat taxes in Britain want to shrink government even more radically than George Osborne does, and that flat taxes are almost the ultimate expression of neoliberal bad governance and should be opposed at all costs. So that would be my advice, I think. On the separate sets of questions, I think you're absolutely right about there is a need for a far wider conversation than we have had, and somebody mentioned DiEM25 and the proposals for reform about the future direction of the European Union. If we get something good out of the referendum, with a vote to remain in the bag, then of course that is a conversation that Britain needs to play a full part in, and the idea that we can have a more democratic, a better functioning European Union, I think can be a popular one and an essential part of that.
Can you hear me? What's your opinion on the transatlantic agreement on trade with Canada and the States? Have you ever discussed any arrangements for the guaranteed basic income?
Yes, on that, on universal basic income, so the idea that everyone should simply receive an income as of right, a flat rate income. It's, as I said, it's an idea that's gaining a lot of ground in Britain and elsewhere in the world as a way of dealing with two things. One is, in part, a loss of public confidence in our existing welfare systems, that when designed, if you take Britain's welfare state, designed in 1945 for a world that looks very different to what it does today, and that there is a need to rethink how that welfare state operates. That's one part of it, and restoring some measure of public trust and confidence in the system, that UBI and people who advocate UBI, universal basic income, say it can do that. The second part is dealing with the changes in the labour market, that if you have more and more people not employed in permanent, full-time, solid, stable jobs, then you need some degree of social protection if people are moving in and out of work, taking on short-term work in temporary contracts, zero-hour contracts. You need, this is the argument, something like a safety net for them. So it's an idea that's gathering a lot of pace. John McDonnell, the finance minister, the shadow finance minister, was at a launch of a report last week, in fact earlier this week, which made the case for a universal basic income system in Britain. It's an interesting idea, and at this point in time we're in a process of looking at a wide range of ideas, of throwing open the doors a bit, of offering things for consideration, and then seeing where we get to in terms of a developed policy programme further down the line. But it's an interesting idea, and one that, as John McDonnell has said, deserves consideration. Oh, TTIP. Oh, yes, and TTIP. Yes, it's look, Jeremy Corbyn has made clear that there are very severe problems with TTIP, particularly associated with the status of the NHS, and I think that's kind of the least you could say about it. That's the position of the leadership as it stands at this point in time. I mean, obviously there have been campaigns across Europe against TTIP. I think people are very concerned about what those provisions might mean, particularly on things like the investor state dispute settlement mechanism, on the idea that there are new courts established that corporations can have access to and the rest of us can't, of the seeming lack of democracy that is coming through in the proposals. So of course there's been a lot of public concern when presented with this right the way across Europe, including Britain, around the provisions of TTIP. I think the challenge for us is to think about how we can come up with better ways to deliver cooperation, investment and trade than the kind of deals that seem to be tied up with TTIP. And again, that's a challenge, I think, for the next year or so. Whether TTIP actually goes through, either as is or in its existing form, I think is a matter for some speculation at this point in time. It looks a lot shakier, I would say, this is my personal opinion, than perhaps it would have done even 12, 18 months ago.
Други въпроси? Къде?
You mentioned that no matter what the outcome of the referendum would be, at any rate, this would be a lesson for the EU. And you said, if I'm not mistaken, you don't give them a permanent pass, so to say, if the EU does not change. My question to you is, do you believe that the EU, many people ask this question, not only in Bulgaria, maybe across Europe, do you believe that the EU initially was a neoliberal project and it was just a community globalization project, and depending on the powers that be, it could be either they adjust it in neoliberal or more social? Well, what's your take on that? And I become more and more pessimistic. I hope you prove me wrong. But there are, for example, the unsanctioned, unauthorized state aid. For example, Bulgaria cannot provide aid to the national railways because this is not authorized improper state aid. This means you have a kid, you have a room for the kid.
Окей, нека да стане дискусия. Добре. Добре, може би има друго мнение. Сега правят концесия на летище София и пак го изпращат. Да, концесия на летище София е стъпка в точно тази посока, брънка от този модел. Добре, благодаря.
Just to be clear on the referendum, and I hope I made clear that the Labour are calling for a vote to remain, and I just want to be certain that's the message. Is the EU was the European integration a neoliberal project? No, I wouldn't say so. I don't think this is a long-standing process going back to the end of the Second World War. That at its foundation, the European coal and steel community, then the European economic community, were not neoliberal projects. The challenge, again, is that given the situation we're in, given the case to remain and reform the EU, the key to this is working out how you make that happen. Now, what I find exciting is that with the events of the last few years, with the economic crisis, with austerity in Europe, you see movements appearing, whether it's movements of protest or whether it's something like perhaps Podemos in Spain, where there is a response and understanding of a need to make a break with neoliberalism. That even, as people have said, the International Monetary Fund is arguing for a need to make a break with neoliberalism. So I'm optimistic in this sense that if the problem has been identified, we might be able to get towards finding a progressive, a fairer, more equitable solution. And that, I think, is what's on the cards in the midst of all of these debates.
Кратък коментар на това, което чух. Ваня Григорова, съм председател.
Chair of Bulgaria of Solidarity. What I hear from James Midway is that there indeed is a battle for the opinion of people, because this is my impression at least. Please correct me, James, if I'm not correct. The people, when they vote in one way and they have a result, they are sure that they will get what they voted for. We for several times see that people voting for one thing and getting something very different. Initially here, the rules are distorted or misplaced. And this, to some extent, compromises the trust in the political system as a whole. I find interesting the following thing in the US too. Young people are those who support people who are not young. Okay, Syriza, you don't have a young person there to... You see older people getting support. And if you have such an analysis, tell us how these people trusted you, believed you that you will live up to your promises. Because in Bulgaria here we get nice promises all the time. And what you say now, we hear this here. But when people who promise get the opportunity to implement it, they find all kinds of excuses not to implement this. And with respect to BBD, and I haven't come across on purely economic surveys of a leftist read on the basic income. In Bulgaria, we also have a guaranteed minimum wage, minimum income, not wage, minimum income, to guarantee the sustenance, survival in Bulgaria. But here it is so very low, 1/5 of the poverty line. So I think that at least here in this country, a solution would be an adequate minimum guaranteed income, means-based, as per some criteria. And I don't fear people will get lazy. No, these are the rightist arguments. What I fear is that this basic income cannot be funded out of the budget as it is. Not even I, but even the ideologists of this basic income will put to challenge the whole system of social assistance. And also probably we would need to raise the VAT. And actually we are the payers of VAT. So do you have any estimates to say in purely economic terms, to make a case in purely economic terms in favor of this universal basic income?
I'll just respond to that. I mean, the challenge with universal basic income, and as I said, this is not Labour policy, it's an interesting idea, but it's nothing more than that at present. The challenge with universal basic income is that it would be such a shift in how our welfare systems operate that knowing what the outcome will be further down the line is quite a difficulty. Now, there are a couple of places running pilot schemes. There's one in Finland, there's one in the Netherlands. So it's a small-scale trial of universal basic income to see how it works, whether it works, what effect it has on people's behaviour, how they work, what they do that might be different. And then we can go back and see in a few years how the scheme is operated. And I think from that we'll be able to draw some decent conclusions about the viability or otherwise of universal basic income. It's not always been, of course, a demand of the left. Milton Friedman, the founding father, virtually, of neoliberalism, was an enthusiast for a universal basic income scheme. He saw it as a way to get rid of most social provision and just give people money. So you say, no more free healthcare, we've given you money. If you're sick, there's your money, go and pay for it. So that was the way the right used this idea to tear up existing provision. Now, I'm not in favour of making things worse for people. On the whole, I think we should be working towards making things better. So I would not want to see, speaking personally, a universal basic income that was operating as a substitute for large chunks of existing welfare provision. But as a means to deal with some of the difficulties in the labour market and the challenges that are bearing down on us around automation. Estimate from the Bank of England chief economist is that 15 million jobs in Britain are at risk of being automated over the next decade. That UBI, universal basic income, might be a way to deal with how the economy of the future will operate, the kind of work we'll be doing, and that existing welfare systems aren't best placed to deal with. As I said, this is not Labour policy, it's an interesting idea for consideration.
Благодаря на всички.
Thank you, everybody. This ends our discussion. Thank you, James, for being with us tonight.